I particularly like talking about the diversity of life within each of the groupings. And so that's this part of the lecture now, where I get to talk about amphibians in all of their great glory and diversity of life. Okay, so amphibians represent about 6,000 species of vertebrates, including those first tetrapods, or at least modern descendants of those first tetrapods that still look a bit like those first tetrapods. They're found in freshwater and terrestrial, but importantly, they remain dependent on water, particularly for reproduction, and at least in one part of that group, for keeping themselves moist, their skin moist. The toads have a much drier skin and can exist in very dry environments, but they still can't reproduce in really dry environments. Now, interestingly, the vast majority of them as adults are carnivores. They can be herbivores as juveniles or omnivores as juveniles. There's a really cool story about if you take one particular species called the spadefoot toad, and if you feed the tadpoles on algae, they'll grow into one form, and if you feed them on food, if you feed them on meat as a carnivore, then they'll grow an entirely different form. It's called a polymorphism. It's really cool. I happen to like amphibians, as does everyone in my family, and here's some pictures I took from different places in the world, including Panama on the left there, Trinidad on the upper right and lower right. That's a Trinidadian tree frog. And in the middle is a rough-skinned newt, which is found up and down the west coast of North America. Now, one of the cool features about amphibians is that they go through this metamorphic process, as did a number of the amphibians, as well as some of the other animals. And that is, they have two different forms of life. Now, in frogs, I think most people are familiar with this. They lay eggs in the water, which then develops into tadpoles who forage in the water mainly. And then they metamorphose, lose the tail, grow the legs, and go out on land and show a period out on land. Not all amphibians have a terrestrial period, but they all have a pseudo-aquatic period, although it's very brief and really just moist for some of them.
For example, these are foam nest frogs, and what they do is they actually place their eggs into this moist foam that they produce up in the trees. So they actually lay their eggs out of the water, but in a moist environment that's facilitated by this foam nest that they produce. Now, ultimately, when the eggs hatch and the tadpoles emerge, they do wriggle their way out of the foam nest and actually drop into water.
So let's watch a video of this. This is a time-lapse video of the process of metamorphosis of a amphibian. And so you can see there, first you get the development of the hind limbs, then you get the development of the front limbs, and then the tail starts to shrink, and you go from a tadpole to a frog. Very cool. Right, so these two life history stages, the larval form and the adult form, there are also some other really cool differences that relate to some of the anatomical features, the diversity of which we've already been talking about and will continue to talk about. The first is the heart is not the same between the two. The heart of a larval amphibian basically looks like that of a fish. It's a two-chambered heart, whereas the heart of an adult amphibian is a three-chambered heart. And as I previously noted, they switch from an herbivorous style to a carnivorous style. Although, as I also noted previously, the larval form can also be carnivorous. There are several major groups of amphibians. The textbook has two of them, that is the Anura, the frogs and toads, and the Urodela, the salamanders. But there's another group I also want to tell you about that's more obscure, called the Caecilians. The salamanders, the frogs and toads, and the Caecilians. Just some of the interesting features about them. For instance, the salamanders, some of them, they never leave the water at all, and some of them have internal fertilization. By contrast, frogs and toads, which are the greatest diversity of these different groups, they do have external fertilization exclusively, but they also have this really cool loud courtship calls. The males gather together and they sing these calls. And there's a spring peeper on the lower right that is extending its buccal sac and forcing that air to make sound. And then finally, Caecilians, which have lost all of their appendages and have internal fertilization. I'll return to caecilians in a second. Let's start with salamanders and newts. Here are some pictures that I've taken from back in the day. And I just wanted to tell a little quick story about these rough-skinned newts here that I took a picture of in British Columbia. Now, when I would set up my traps for stickleback, I would get lots and lots of these rough-skinned newts. And they live entirely underwater. They don't have to come up to breathe because they can respire through their skin through the water. But then they come up and my minnow traps, which stickleback traps, would be full of these rough-skinned newts. And my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, came out with me and helped me sample them. And I have this picture of her holding all these rough-skinned newts. And I found out later that in some places in the world, they're extremely poisonous. You have evolutionary arms races between how poisoned those newts are and the resistance of the snakes that eat them. Fortunately, where we were, they weren't super poisonous. And then there's a batch of salamander eggs in the bottom there, and you can see they look a bit green, and that's because there are sometimes photosynthetic algae within the actual eggs. Here's just a few more cool frog and toad pictures. The one on the upper left is from Trinidad, and if you look really closely, you can see that it has tadpoles stuck to its back. So I can remember walking on the forest floor in Trinidad, and I always carried my camera with me, and I kind of felt lame that I hadn't taken many pictures. And I saw a little tiny frog hopping around. I didn't know anything about it, and so I got out my macro lenses and got down and started taking pictures. And the students were standing, my students were great, but they were standing there going like, okay, we got to go sample our fish, come on, stop taking pictures. And then I blew up the picture on the back of my digital camera. I'm like, oh my God, there's little tadpoles on the back of that frog. And then, of course, we were all very excited for a long period of time. On the upper right, you have the tree frog from Panama, a really big, giant tree frog, about yay big. And then on the lower part, you have frogs from Quebec, including two bullfrogs fighting on the left there, and those were the same bullfrogs in the same area where I have the video of my daughter catching them in the introductory video and them trying to grab a bobber. They get extremely aggressive during the breeding season when they're trying to attract females.
Here's a video that someone else took of bullfrogs fighting during the mating season. Presumably they're trying to obtain the best territory, which will then also help them to attract the best mate.
This is my only encounter with a caecilian. So I was taking pictures of this lizard in Panama, and there was this worm, I thought a worm or snake or something on the ground that the lizard was grabbing. And so I have a picture of the lizard trying to eat this thing. And my daughter, who was quite young at the time, rushed in and decided to save it from the lizard. And so here she is with the only caecilian I've actually seen in the wild. It turns out that caecilians can also cause an extremely allergic reaction in some people, fortunately not her.
There are several major groups of caecilians, as you can see in the phylogeny on the right, and there's a great diversity of color and size, from very small to almost 1.5 meters long, and you can see the depiction of some of this diversity on the left-hand side. They also have some pretty funky anatomy. On the left is a description and picture of some of the anatomy of one of the species and some of the features, including the rudimentary eyes and the little tentacle on the head and the annuli around the body. And on the right, you see what appears to be evidence for venom-producing glands associated with the teeth in one particular species. So not only are they poisonous through glands on their skin, which could have hurt my daughter in the previous picture, but also they have active venom, which perhaps they use for subduing prey. Cool critters.
Now, I also want to take the opportunity to say something cool about amphibians with respect to the great diversity of reproductive systems they have. Now, if you think about the way different organisms work, there's one major continuum on which they align their reproductive strategies. And that is, on one end, you have individuals where the females produce billions of offspring, huge numbers of eggs and offspring, but they don't provide any parental care, just sort of release them into nature and hope that they survive, hope that some of them survive. On the other side, you have ones that produce only one offspring at a time and then care for it for a long period of time until maturity, like humans or a number of other mammals. Of course, humans can also sometimes produce twins or triplets, etc. Now, most amphibians actually provide relatively little parental care for their young, but there are some really, really cool reproductive oddities that I want to tell you about because they're just so cool. On the left, you have that frog in Trinidad that carries its tadpoles around on its back in a moist environment. They don't actually grow up in a pool in the stream. They actually grow up on the back of the dad. And then below that, you have an even more extreme case called the marsupial frog. And here, they actually deposit the eggs underneath this skin on the back of the male. And so the male goes around carrying the eggs, and then the larvae hatch out of the skin and eventually metamorphose and go on to live the adult life.
So this evolution of egg carrying on the back in one form or another has occurred several times in the phylogenetic tree of amphibians. So on the right, you see the phylogenetic tree. All the green are the anurans, the frogs, and the fifth column over is egg transporting. So all of the dark dots on that correspond to the independent evolution of egg carrying in one group of frogs.
And even more extreme on the right there is the gastric brooding frog that would actually swallow its eggs, and then the eggs would develop in the stomach, and then they would hatch in the stomach and feed off of secretions that were released in the stomach. In Australia is where they're from. Sadly, they went extinct very shortly after their discovery. There are many other cool reproductive oddities of amphibians, and I will now tell you about a few more of them.
This tiny poison arrow frog is carrying his tadpole piggerback. It hatched on a leaf, and now he's taking it to a pool in a bromeliad, high up in the branches. The tadpole wriggles off. He may have half a dozen babies, each of which he puts into its own tiny pool. This youngster is hungry, and tells him so by nibbling his legs and vibrating against his body. He has to find a female. He calls to the female encouragingly. She produces food for the hungry tadpole. An infertile egg. Baby has its dinner.
Now this is a really cool reproductive oddity that was only discovered relatively recently, and this is with caecilians. So there you see two different caecilians. One is, two different forms of caecilians. The small ones are the babies, the young, and the large one is the mom. And it looks like the young are ripping the skin off the mom. And indeed, this is an evolved strategy for the female to provision the young. That is, she sloughs off her skin and the larvae eat it for the nutrition contained therein. And they have specialized teeth for doing so.
Indeed, caecilians do have some pretty crazy teeth. And so you see some images here of some of the most extreme ones. And more generally, the evolution of teeth combined with, in some branches, the evolution of tooth loss is one of the most variable things in the phylogeny and the evolutionary history of amphibians, as this figure shows for frogs focusing on tooth loss. If you remember from the previous lecture on fish, I discussed how Pacific salmon were semoparous. That means they reproduce only once and die. Many other organisms, however, are iteroparous. That is, they will spawn or breed in multiple times. So let's see how that plays out in amphibians. It turns out that within amphibians, semoparity is quite rare. Instead, most of the species live to reproduce multiple times. However, in some groups, semoparity is reasonably common, including the hyla frogs, with one representative of that group being the gladiator frog. Gladiator frogs are named there thusly because they do a lot of fighting, both for mates and to protect their eggs from incursion by other males. Perhaps these massive reproductive efforts mean that they simply can't survive to reproduce again because they don't have enough energy.
That's all for amphibians. The next lecture is going to be about reptiles. Now, reptile lecture is really cool, and it's all about how organisms get away from water altogether. So unlike amphibians that need to retain moisture for at least their reproductive period, reptiles get completely away from water, which means that they have to develop a new form of egg and reproduction, and also they need to evolve a new form of excretion, which we will tell you about in the next lecture. And of course, we'll talk about ball pythons and geckos and all the super cool things that we have in our house.